This is Dead State, Massachusetts, where we examine the crimes that shaped a place, not just the headlines that survived it. A suffocating morning, a narrow house on 2nd Street, windows open, curtains barely moving, a father resting downstairs, a stepmother upstairs. By midday, the silence inside those walls had been split in two, and the only suspect would walk free. This is the story of Lizzie Borden. Fall River, August 4th, 1892. The heat came first. It smothered the house like a pillow pressed against screaming lips, suffocating, unrelenting air that clung to faded wallpaper and heavy wool. The Borden residence stood tall and thin on 2nd Street, windows flung wide yet trapping the stifling air inside. Morning had turned rancid. Yesterday's mutton hung in the atmosphere with the odor of rotting fat clinging to skin and hair. In the dining room, flies circled with drowsy purpose. Upstairs, Abby Borden entered the guest bedroom. The space lay dormant most days, barren, a narrow bed against the wall, a simple bureau, morning light cutting across the floor in sharp, pale bands. She lifted her dusting cloth. What broke the silence came without warning, a wet, splitting sound that violated the quiet house. No cry for help, no desperate scramble down the hallway. Each strike fell with purpose, not panic, methodical, precise, until Abby's form crumpled beside the bed. Silence reclaimed the room. Downstairs, the front door opened at 10:45 a.m. Andrew Borden shuffled in, weary from town errands and the oppressive heat. He lowered himself onto the sitting room sofa. Half-drawn curtains filtered the harsh daylight. Stale air pressed against his skin. He turned to face the wall. Something whistled through the air, then connected, the impact echoing through the house like ice fracturing on a frozen pond. Another followed. Whoever wielded the weapon remained. The weapon rose and fell until stillness replaced struggle. When it ended, the house held new secrets. Crimson bloomed across the sofa fabric. Tiny droplets marked the wallpaper like grotesque punctuation. Iron and salt cut through the muggy afternoon air. Above, Abby remained motionless beside the guest bed. Below, Andrew rested awkwardly against the sofa arm, his expression frozen in a question never to be answered. The residence baked in the sun, the heavy air inside thickening with each silent minute. Curtains barely stirred. No one outside heard a scream, only the relentless drone of flies drawn to the scent of blood in the stillness. Minutes later, a woman's voice would break the silence, calling for the maid. The blows that fell in that house would reverberate far beyond 2nd Street, becoming whispers passed from generation to generation. But to understand what happened that morning, you have to step back from the bodies. Downstairs, before the blows ever landed, there was Andrew. The father, Andrew Borden's violence wasn't in his fists. It manifested in ledger books, in pennies hoarded despite a fortune that could have purchased comfort. The man clutched wealth like oxygen, yet refused to breathe it into his home. 2nd Street knew him by his property holdings, commercial buildings downtown, shares in 3 banks, parcels of valuable land. Yet inside his own walls, chamber pots still needed emptying, and winter drafts whistled through gaps he wouldn't pay to seal. His daughters bathed in carried water while he counted interest. The house stood like Andrew himself, thin-lipped, unyielding, a monument to restraint that bordered on cruelty. At 32, Lizzie Borden existed in a gilded cage. Her education, church attendance, and social standing, all the markers of respectability, couldn't unlock the iron constraints of her circumstances. Every aspect of her financial existence flowed from her father's pen. Andrew's signature authorized her present comforts and dictated her future security. The Massachusetts legal system of 1892 offered unmarried women like Lizzie no pathway to autonomy without inherited wealth. With each property deed he signed, each investment he directed, each inheritance decision he contemplated, Andrew Borden wasn't just managing assets. He was determining the boundaries of his daughter's world. Not a single acre transferred to his daughters. The ledger told a story clearer than any argument could. In that suffocating house, inheritance wasn't merely wealth, but the only path to breathing freely, to walking out the front door without permission. Andrew never raised his voice. He didn't need to. His power was embedded in every floorboard, every legal document, every Massachusetts statute that rendered his daughters essentially powerless. The walls themselves seemed to whisper this truth daily. And upstairs, behind a closed door, was Abby. And Abby Borden arrived as the stepmother, a stranger in a home already formed. Though younger than Andrew, her 40-something face bore none of youth's softness. Her blood ran elsewhere, to cousins and siblings whose names meant nothing to the Borden girls. At the dinner table, Lizzie's voice would shape the formal Mrs. Borden into something cool and precise, never once slipping into mother. Across all those years, such formality couldn't hide behind closed doors. It hung in the air between past salt cellars and echoed in footsteps that carefully avoided collision on the narrow staircase. In that house, Abby and Lizzie crossed paths like ships, signaling danger. Each property deed Andrew signed over to Abby's relatives became another brick in the wall between them. The land transfers weren't just legal documents, they were declarations of allegiance. To her, Abby wasn't merely the woman who had replaced her mother. She was the sentry at the vault door, the rival for what little security remained. When Abby fell in that seldom-used guest bedroom, a room kept pristine and cold like a tomb, she died in a space that reflected her position in the house. Necessary but unwelcome, present but peripheral, the guest bedroom existed in limbo, neither fully claimed nor entirely abandoned. Blood first spilled where no one belonged, in that upstairs sanctuary far from 2nd Street's prying eyes. Consider the location. If driven by fury, Abby died, where the battle for future security seemed most intimate. If plotted with care, neighbors would hear nothing but stillness. But Lizzie was not the only daughter in that house. Emma Borden was Lizzie's older sister and shared the home, a quieter presence, more withdrawn than Lizzie, the steadier of the two. Yet on the morning of August 4th, 1892, Emma's bed remained empty. She had left days earlier to visit friends in Fairhaven, 13 miles and a world away from the events unfolding at home. This absence hangs in the historical record like a question mark. If someone struck out in sudden fury that day, how fortunate they acted when the only other adult Borden had conveniently departed. There is also a maid because the Borden household maintained appearances with a single domestic servant, Bridget Sullivan, a young Irish immigrant whom they called Maggie, despite it not being her name. On that morning, she labored, washing windows until exhaustion overtook her. Her testimony placed her outside during Abby's murder, and later retreating to her cramped attic quarters for rest. The timing creates a convenient vacuum. Both Bordens met their end precisely when the only other occupant of the house could neither witness nor intervene. First outdoors, then collapsed in upstairs slumber. Bridget Sullivan moved through the house that day as its sole living witness. Her ears caught no screams, no crashes, no footfalls of struggle that might have pulled her from her tasks. Yet when she viewed the bodies, the savagery of the attacks was undeniable. Later, she would recall how Lizzie's voice had cut through the afternoon stillness. "Come down quick. Father's dead. Somebody came in and killed him." The contradiction haunted investigators. Lizzie claimed an intruder, yet Bridget insisted all doors remained locked from inside. The Irish maid occupied a unique position, simultaneously insider and outsider, a working-class observer in a wealthy household, the only person whose testimony could map the movements within those fatal hours. Whispers about Bridget circulated first, the Irish maid's foreignness making her an easier target than the church-going daughter of a prominent family. Victorian sensibilities couldn't reconcile the image of a well-bred New England woman with such savagery, not when an immigrant stood nearby, conveniently different in every way that mattered to Fall River society in 1892. By her 32nd summer, Lizzie Borden occupied that peculiar limbo. Her status raised no eyebrows at church functions or charitable meetings where she regularly appeared, yet it hung about her like a faint perfume, detectable but rarely mentioned in polite company. Though her education and social standing marked her as a woman of quality, each night she returned to her father's narrow house on 2nd Street, her independence extending precisely as far as Andrew Borden's permission allowed. In 1892, America, an adult daughter without a husband remained in essence a perpetual child regardless of her capabilities. The question of Lizzie's spinsterhood seems straightforward to modern ears, but in 1892, historical records offer no explanation, no broken engagement, no failed romance, no tragic loss of a suitor. The absence of any courtship narrative in Lizzie's past creates a curious void. This historical blank space speaks volumes. Andrew Borden's legendary thrift manifested not as prudence but as a stranglehold. Despite his considerable fortune, he refused even basic modern conveniences that other families of their station took for granted. Young men calling on a potential bride would have encountered not just the physical austerity of the Borden home, but its emotional climate. Cool, restrained, dominated by Andrew's financial control. Marriage prospects faced practical obstacles beyond atmosphere. Victorian unions required financial arrangements, and Andrew's wealth existed primarily in land and investments rather than accessible funds. A proper dowry demanded liquidity. If Andrew hesitated to convert assets or release capital from his grip, potential matches would quietly dissolve before they formed. The 2nd Street house itself presented another barrier, undersized for a family of their means, lacking the spacious parlors where courtship rituals might unfold. Lizzie developed a demeanor ill-suited to Victorian romantic pursuit, devout but reserved, proper but distant, present at social functions yet somehow apart from them. For Lizzie, spinsterhood meant existing in a state of suspended animation, financially breathing but never fully alive. She possessed neither income of her own nor legal standing to acquire it. Property, wealth, security, all remained locked behind her father's signature, accessible only through his continued goodwill or eventual death. Andrew Borden's will governed more than his assets. It dictated the very boundaries of his daughter's existence. She inhabited a peculiar purgatory, neither destitute nor independent, neither secure nor free, a woman whose economic pulse beat entirely at her father's discretion. Her education offered scant protection against these fates. The church committees she chaired and the charitable work that filled her calendar provided social standing, but not a single dollar of income. Andrew's fortune wasn't merely comfort. It was the only barrier between Lizzie and a life of genteel desperation. Despite possessing a fortune worth millions in today's currency, Andrew Borden maintained a household of conspicuous austerity. The 2nd Street home lacked indoor plumbing, featured sparse furnishings, and operated under tight financial constraints, while his true wealth remained in properties and investments that only he controlled. The recent transfer of valuable real estate to his second wife's relatives created a fault line through the household. Victorian inheritance patterns offered no guarantees to daughters, particularly with a stepmother positioned to redirect family assets to her own relations should she outlive her husband. For Lizzie and Emma, their father's financial decisions weren't merely disappointing. They represented an existential threat. Each property transfer diminished their future security. Each asset redirected to Abby's family fed a smoldering anxiety that their birthright might vanish with their father's last breath. While Lizzie cultivated a social presence, her sister Emma moved through Fall River like a shadow, older, more reserved, equally trapped. Neither woman controlled a dollar of their own. Andrew's will represented their only security, and recent property transfers to Abby's relatives had already eroded that foundation. The household architecture itself told the story. Two aging daughters, one iron-fisted patriarch, and a stepmother whose bloodline threatened to divert their birthright. At 32, Lizzie Borden moved through rooms that betrayed no hint of her father's fortune, austere spaces that mocked the family's actual standing. The recent property transfer to her stepmother's relatives had shifted the ground beneath her feet. Without husband, without income of her own, without legal recourse, each morning Lizzie woke to the same reality. Her father's signature determined whether she ate well or poorly, dressed fashionably or plainly, traveled or remained confined to Fall River. This chokehold of economic dependence wrapped around her daily existence. Maintain perfect composure in church pews while calculating dwindling prospects. Smile graciously at social gatherings while swallowing rage. Perform daughterly devotion while watching inheritance slip away. With no acceptable outlet for such emotions, they could only circulate within her, gathering pressure like steam in a sealed vessel. Had Andrew Borden lived another decade or two, his daughter might have withered, an aging spinster tending to elderly parents, watching her social relevance fade with each passing season. Worse still, if Abby outlived her husband and redirected the family fortune, both Lizzie and Emma faced a devastating possibility: displacement from the only security they'd ever known. Perhaps what drove the blade wasn't rage but terror, the quiet panic of a woman watching her future dissolve. Each property transfer to Abby's relatives represented another door closing, another year without heat, without plumbing, without autonomy. Andrew's pen controlled every aspect of Lizzie's survival: her shelter, her food, her social standing. When that pen began redirecting the family fortune away from her, the walls of 2nd Street must have seemed to inch closer each night. By August 4th, 1892, when Bridget descended, she found Andrew sprawled on the sofa, his face so mutilated by the hatchet's blows that bone and flesh had merged into a single, unrecognizable ruin. The air in the sitting room was thick with the metallic tang of blood, sharp and nauseating above the lingering staleness of the house. The oppressive heat seemed to amplify the stench, making every breath taste of iron and sweat. One eye, nearly split in half, stared out blindly through a mask of blood. The savagery was unmistakable. This was not the work of a desperate thief, but something far more intimate. When neighbors and Dr. Bowen arrived, the horror was so immediate that one question slipped out before shock could fully set in: where is Mrs. Borden? When questioned about Abby's whereabouts, Lizzie claimed she had left to visit an ailing acquaintance. A concerned neighbor, unconvinced, suggested they search the upper floor. As they climbed the narrow stairs, the smell of copper grew thicker. In the guest room, Abby's body lay face down beside the bed, her form already stiffening with death. The back of her skull had been split open so brutally that glistening bone pushed through her graying hair, the patterned carpet beneath her a dark, spreading lake of blood. A silent testament to the violence that had erupted in that still, airless room. Physicians later determined Abby had been killed significantly earlier than Andrew, revealing a chilling timeline. 2 separate acts of violence had occurred hours apart, yet somehow without alerting a single soul in the neighborhood. Initially, authorities cast a wide net of suspicion. Perhaps a vagrant had wandered onto the property. Perhaps a business enemy of Andrew's had sought revenge. Perhaps some nameless outsider had slipped in undetected. Yet, as investigators cataloged the scene, these theories dissolved. The house remained sealed, doors secured from within, windows undisturbed, valuables untouched. The evidence pointed not to random violence, but to something more personal. And when violence bears the mark of intimacy, investigators need not look far for suspects. Here, the investigation entered murky waters. The prosecution faced a stark reality. Not a single witness observed the murders. When officers examined Lizzie's garments, they found no visible bloodstains. The presumed weapon, a hatchet head discovered in the basement, had been wiped clean, its handle mysteriously absent. Even this potential murder weapon could not be definitively linked to the ghastly wounds. Forensic capabilities in 1892 offered little assistance. Blood typing remained unknown, fingerprint analysis existed only in its infancy, and DNA evidence lay decades in the future. Investigators instead scrutinized Lizzie herself, and what they observed deeply troubled them. Her composure appeared unnaturally steady, her responses calculated, her demeanor disconcertingly controlled. As investigators pressed, Lizzie's account developed subtle inconsistencies. She described searching the barn for fishing sinkers during the critical time frame, a task that stretched improbably long in her telling. Between these supposed barn excursions, she mentioned eating pears, reading and hearing nothing of the violence unfolding mere rooms away. Most damning was her decision, days after the murders, to burn a dress she claimed had been merely stained with paint. This destruction of potential evidence raised immediate red flags for prosecutors. Yet despite these troubling circumstances, the case against her remained entirely circumstantial. Lizzie Borden's trial commenced in June 1893, drawing spectators who filled every inch of the new Bedford courthouse. Victorian society, particularly its women, watched with horrified fascination as prosecutors painted Lizzie as a calculating heiress who seized opportunity within her own home, changing her story when convenient while maintaining an unnervingly placid demeanor throughout the investigation. Her defense team methodically dismantled this portrait, emphasizing the complete absence of physical evidence, no bloodied garments despite the brutality of the attacks, no eyewitnesses to place her at either crime scene, no conclusive murder weapon, and no motive beyond financial speculation that could drive a Sunday school teacher to such violence. The defense's most powerful argument, however, transcended evidence entirely. They presented Lizzie Borden as the embodiment of Victorian feminine virtue, a devoted Sunday school teacher who attended church faithfully and maintained impeccable social standing. The jurors, products of their era, found themselves confronting an impossible equation. Could hands that distributed Bible verses truly wield a hatchet with such savagery? After deliberating briefly, they delivered their verdict, not guilty. Lizzie emerged from the courthouse a free woman, the specter of the gallows permanently dispelled. A contemporary investigation would immediately recognize the hallmarks of an insider crime. No signs of forced entry. Nothing was stolen. No neighbors heard struggles or unfamiliar voices. Modern forensic science would scrutinize the substantial time gap between the two deaths, analyze blood spatter patterns for positioning and premeditation, and flag Lizzie's behavioral inconsistencies as significant red flags. The financial motive, property transfers, and inheritance concerns would provide the framework for understanding why violence erupted. According to the medical examiner, Abby Borden had been dead for hours before her husband. This timeline creates a disturbing sequence. An attacker murdered Abby, remained in or returned to the house, then waited to kill Andrew separately. Such calculated patience fundamentally contradicts what we would expect from a desperate stranger who had broken in. Today's forensic experts would note that despite the brutality of the attacks, the killer might have escaped with surprisingly minimal bloodstains. The physics of blood spatter reveals strategic possibilities. Approaching from behind would shield the attacker from arterial spray. Wearing an apron or smock would catch most evidence, and changing clothes promptly afterward would eliminate remaining traces. Through this modern lens, Lizzie's decision to burn that dress days after the murders transforms from curious footnote to damning calculation. The Borden estate wasn't just wealth. It was Lizzie's only safety net in a world where women couldn't vote or maintain independent finances. When Andrew began transferring deeds to Abby's relatives, he wasn't just moving papers between filing cabinets. He was potentially dismantling his daughter's future security piece by piece. Should Abby outlive him, those property transfers might continue, leaving Lizzie with diminishing resources. Beyond the courtroom's strict standards of evidence lies the cold mathematics of probability. Only Lizzie possessed the complete quartet of criminal prerequisites. She was there when it happened, stood to gain financially, had access to every room, and exhibited the strange calm that investigators recognize as either calculated deception or psychological fracture. The scales of likelihood tip heavily in one direction. Yet probability, however compelling, remains distinct from certainty. The shadow of doubt, however slight, cannot be entirely banished. Consider her actions not as an eruption, but as the final crack in a foundation stressed beyond endurance. Picture Lizzie Borden, 32 years old, in a society where unmarried women her age were already considered lost causes. Each morning she woke to the same restrictions, watching her father's wealth that should have provided comfort, instead funding property acquisitions for her stepmother's relatives. Every deed transfer represented another thread of her safety net being cut. In the America of 1892, a husband wasn't just companionship, he was financial shelter. This wasn't pressure that announced itself with dramatic declarations. It accumulated silently. In the chamber pot she emptied because her millionaire father refused indoor plumbing. In the winter chill he wouldn't spend to properly address. Perhaps what drove the hatchet wasn't hatred at all. Perhaps it was survival. Imagine the air growing thinner with each passing minute. First, Abby falls. Upstairs, dust cloth still in hand. This wasn't random. The clock ticks forward. Silence settles over the house. Andrew returns home. He reclines on the sofa. If premeditated, what follows isn't an outburst, but a conclusion. The final piece of a carefully arranged puzzle. In this scenario, the killer understood the household's rhythms perfectly. When Bridget would step outside to wash windows, when Emma would be visiting friends, when her father would take his afternoon rest. The execution is methodical, contained, carried out in rooms she's navigated for 32 years. After the deed, she straightens her dress, summons assistance, displays appropriate distress, not from emotional detachment, but from years of Victorian training that demanded composure regardless of circumstances. This reading suggests precision, not frenzy. Consider another possibility entirely, not calculation, but collapse. The human psyche, when compressed too long, doesn't just bend, it shatters. 32 years of silent compliance, a lifetime of smiling when told to smile, speaking when permitted to speak. Then the property transfers begin. Heated words echo, bitterness crystallizes, until that August morning when 90-degree heat presses down on a house with no escape, and something inside Lizzie Borden finally breaks. The first blow catches Abby between the shoulders. The next 19 aren't strategy, they're release. The arm rises and falls in a rhythm beyond conscious thought, the mind floating somewhere above the body that continues its mechanical work. Then stillness, waiting without planning. When Andrew's key turns in the lock hours later, Lizzie moves not from cunning, but from a terrible momentum already set in motion. Afterward, she summons help with a voice drained of inflection. She answers police in clipped, hollow phrases. She destroys evidence without urgency or concern. This isn't the composure of a mastermind. It's the flatness that follows catastrophic emotional rupture, not the cold precision of chess, but the eerie calm after psychological implosion. These competing theories each illuminate different aspects of the crime. If Lizzie acted with calculation, it explains why she waited until Emma was safely away, why Abby died hours before Andrew, and why no windows or doors were broken. But if she snapped under pressure, we understand the savage overkill of those repeated blows and the eerie calm that witnesses described afterward. Not the composure of deception, but the hollow aftermath of psychological collapse. The complexity lies in this paradox. Premeditation and psychological break aren't mutually exclusive. Someone might harbor resentment for decades, mentally rehearse scenarios, feel the pressure mounting day by day, yet still experience a profound disconnection when finally acting. The hand that grips the hatchet can follow a plan while the mind floats somewhere above the body. This case exists in that unsettling middle ground. Neither the work of a calculating monster nor a helpless victim, but of a woman financially trapped in a house each passing year, each property transfer, each silent dinner. The jury delivered their verdict in 1893, not guilty. On paper, Lizzie Borden was innocent. But Fall River's sidewalks told a different story. When Andrew's will cleared probate, his daughters received what would now amount to millions. Consider the optics. A woman suspected of hatcheting her father for inheritance promptly purchased an elegant home in the fashionable Highland district. Maplecroft, she christened it. Water flowed from taps, not carried in buckets. No chamber pots to empty. Just the flush of modern toilets in a neighborhood where no one mentioned axes. Maplecroft stood as a monument to the fortune Andrew Borden had hoarded in life. While he had pinched pennies until they screamed, his daughter now installed modern plumbing and hosted afternoon teas beneath crystal chandeliers. This conspicuous display only deepened her neighbors' suspicions. Though Lizzie cultivated a veneer of respectability and even dared to befriend theater people, shocking for provincial Fall River, the social membrane remained impermeable. Ladies clutched their handbags tighter when she approached. Gentlemen suddenly remembered urgent business across the street. For 34 more years, she inhabited this limbo, legally cleared yet perpetually condemned until death finally closed her case in 1927, leaving behind a woman acquitted by 12 men but convicted by an entire town. For 13 years, the Borden sisters shared Maplecroft's elegant rooms, presenting a united front to a suspicious town. Then came 1905. Without warning or public statement, Emma packed her belongings and left the mansion. Whatever words passed between them in those final days remained private. No newspaper reported their quarrel. No letter explained the rift. The sisters who had weathered national scandal together spent the remaining 22 years of their lives in complete estrangement. Rumors circulated that Emma had grown disturbed by Lizzie's new associations. Perhaps the theater people, perhaps something more scandalous. Some whispered that Emma had finally confronted a truth about those murders she could no longer deny. The sisters' final conversation remains unrecorded, but whatever words passed between them proved terminal. For two women who had presented a united front against an accusing world, to sever all ties suggests a breach beyond repair. When Lizzie drew her final breath in 1927, Emma followed 9 days later. Their bodies now rest in the family plot, separated by mere feet of soil, an eternal proximity their living selves had rejected. After the trial concluded, Bridget Sullivan, the Irish immigrant maid whom the Bordens called Maggie, vanished from Fall River streets. She traveled westward across America, eventually settling in Montana, where she built a life far removed from hatchets and headlines. Though she had scrubbed the Borden floors, discovered Andrew's body, and endured intense police questioning, Bridget carried whatever she knew or suspected to her grave in 1948. No tell-all interviews, no dramatic accusations, no public theorizing about her former employer. The woman who had briefly stood at the bloody center of America's most sensational murder simply stepped out of its frame, leaving behind only questions about what she might have witnessed in those cramped, fatal rooms. What haunts me most is the aftermath. Lizzie traded family bonds for fortune, wealth in exchange for becoming a pariah. Emma secured financial freedom at the cost of sisterhood. Bridget escaped with her life but surrendered everything familiar. Only the house remained unchanged. The legal verdict came and went. The mystery persisted. No alternate suspect materialized from the shadows. No whispered confession resolved the puzzle in anyone's final moments. Just 3 women forever marked by whatever transpired on that morning. The court records were archived. The whispers never ceased. The Borden residence remains standing in Fall River, now transformed into both museum and lodging. Visitors don't merely observe, they inhabit. The very bedroom where Abby's body crumpled awaits overnight guests. The sitting room where Andrew's skull split open still welcomes visitors. Every architectural constraint, the cramped staircase, the suffocating hallway, persists unchanged. Some come for historical curiosity, others for the promised supernatural encounters, but what truly draws them isn't the specter of ghosts, it's the silence, the unanswered questions, the deep need for resolution that history never gave. We transform horror into tourism to master what once terrified us. The Borden house stands as a testament that homes can shelter violence, that family can fracture, that certainty is always just out of reach. Lizzie's acquittal left the case suspended, her guilt or innocence debated, but never decided. In the end, the rhyme outlived the trial. Memory chose its villain. Maybe you heard this rhyme. Children started singing it just a few years after the murders. It goes like this. Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. But the actual numbers are wrong. Abby Borden was struck roughly 18 or 19 times. Andrew Borden about 10 or 11, brutal, deliberate. The rhyme didn't care about accuracy. It cared about memory, and memory chose its villain. The courtroom set her free. The culture did not. Understanding the past doesn't require defending it. Context explains behavior, but it doesn't absolve power. And the rhyme? It's still whispered. You've been listening to Dead State, Massachusetts. If this episode stayed with you, follow the show, leave a rating, and share it with someone who still believes the past stays buried. I hope you'll be listening.